Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're undertaking a detailed, deep exploration of a figure whose influence on industry, on labor, and really on American life rivals that of virtually any president, Henry. And this isn't just a discussion about how he built a car. Our mission here is to extract the complex, interwoven, and frankly, often shocking insights from his entire life.
Right.
We're going to be looking at everything from the revolutionary business practices that define the 20th century, like the assembly line, to his later, deeply regrettable political and social.
And to really understand the scale of Ford's impact, I think we have to start not with him as a titan, but with this specific pivotal moment of creation. Picture this. It's October 1st, 1908, in the Paquette Avenue factory in Detroit, Michigan. The final, unassuming touches are being placed on a new car, the Model T.
Just another car rolling off the line, you'd think.
Exactly. But this was no ordinary vehicle launch. It didn't just transform personal transportation. By selling 15 million units over the next 19 years, this simple machine fundamentally revolutionized human industry itself through the concept of mass production. It really paved the way for modern consumer capital.
What stands out to me immediately is the sheer, unbelievable scale of the societal revolution. But if you look at his origins, the path seems so improbable.
Very.
How did a man born right in the rural middle of the 19th century, long before global industrial titans were a thing, back when America was still defined by farms, how did he become this pivotal figure who ushered in the entire age of the automobile?
To understand the source of Henry Ford's relentless drive and his specific worldview, which, later translated into an almost tyrannical desire for control, we have to look back at Henry Ford the boy and his family history. Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863, on a modest family farm in Springwells Township, Michigan. This area, it wasn't the sprawling suburban landscape of Dearborn today. It was quiet, agricultural, still very distinct and rural from the growing city of Detroit to the...
But the roots go back even further than Michigan. You've referred to the Fords as double immigrant, which paints this fascinating centuries-spanning picture of placement, opportunity, and maybe a deep-seated insecurity. Tell us about that.
That narrative of movement and instability is just crucial to the Ford family. They originally hailed from Somerset in the west of England. They migrated to County Cork in the south of Ireland, probably during the 16th century. They were English Protestant who moved to take advantage of favorable land offers made available during the English plantation era in Ireland.
Moving for land sounds advantageous, but they weren't exactly landed gentry when they were in Ireland, were they?
Oh, far from it. They were among the less fortunate of the British planters. They were relatively impoverished tenant farmers, working rented land, much like the Irish Catholics they lived alongside.
So a very precarious.
Extremely. Highly dependent on commodity prices and critically on the staple crop, the potato. So when the devastating potato famine hit in the 1840s, the entire economic foundation of their lives just collapsed. In 1847, Henry's grandfather, John, and his father, William, fled the small village of Ballinascardy in Cork.
So they came to America not for some abstract idea of opportunity, but specifically fleeing starvation. They were seeking survival. How much of Ford's later, almost tyrannical drive do you think was rooted in that memory of intense poverty?
It's impossible to quantify, but that drive for stability and self-sufficiency is a hallmark of his entire career. When they arrived, they joined relatives already settled on the American frontier near Dearborn. They were escaping a horror famine, but entering this dynamic, rapidly changing environment in Michigan. By the time Henry was born in 1863, the family's fortunes had already started to shift pretty dramatically, and that's primarily thanks to Michigan's industrial explosion.
And that explosion wasn't about automobiles yet, it was about wood.
Precisely. Michigan was at the center of this enormous temporary economic engine known as the timber rush. This was Michigan's equivalent of the California gold rush.
Wow.
The region was incredibly densely forested, and America was growing at a staggering pace. There was just this massive demand for building a country where the population was growing by millions every single decade. This rush provided massive amounts of raw capital and jobs, and it rapidly turned Michigan into an industrial hub.
That is just an amazing feedback loop. The demand for wood effectively built the wealth that funded Ford's family, which then allowed him to receive the education that set him up perfectly for the next phase.
It created the aspiring middle class that Henry grew up. And crucially, Henry was well educated. He attended a Scottish settlement school, he became fully literate, but his focus was on mathematics and mechanics, subjects that were foundational to his later engineering career. And he showed that early aptitude for mechanics constantly.
Yes, the classic story of the young tinkerer.
A keenly observed interest from a very young age. He was constantly messing with clocks and engines, trying to understand their inner workings. Two defining moments really stand out when he was just 12 years old in 1875.
Okay.
First, receiving a watch as a gift, which he famously disassembled and reassembled perfectly, cementing his reputation as the local clock repairman.
Right.
And second, seeing his first non-horse-drawn vehicle, the Nichols and Shepherd Road End, a massive portable steam engine used for farm. Seeing that machine moving without an animal clearly planted the seed of a self-propelled future in his mind.
That encounter perfectly frames the technological. Everything was expanding and demanding.
Absolutely. And we have to recognize the sheer demographic and industrial strength that was underpinning 19th century America. In 1800, the U.S. population was barely 5 million, mostly confined to the Atlantic seaboard. By 1850, it was 23 million, pushing settlement deep into the interior, particularly the Great Lakes region.
And then the West opens up.
The American West was rapidly opening up post-Mexican-American War, followed by the gold, silver, and oil rush that drove these huge waves of migration.
So the need to move people and goods faster and more efficiently than ever before.
Right. And by the time Ford was ready to launch his great venture around 1900, the country's population had exploded to 76 million people. Underlying all this growth was massive technological development. The Industrial Revolution arrived comparatively early in the U.S., and by the second half of the 19th century, American inventors were starting to eclipse their European counterparts.
Most notably Thomas
Edison, who pioneered electrification and, of course, the burgeoning field of internal.
So the foundation is set. A background rooted in the scarcity of the old world, a childhood capitalizing on the industrial wealth of the and a technical education. This sets him up perfectly for the age of electricity and the internal combustion. Okay, let's jump now from the farm boy in Springwells to the apprentice machinist. Right. Henry left the rural area and moved to the city at the end of the 70s. What kind of city was he walking?
A booming one. I mean, when Henry's father first arrived in the late 1840s, Detroit's population was around 15,000. By 1879, when young Henry relocated there, it had topped 100,000 people and was becoming a center for heavy machinery and manufacturing, thanks in part to the infrastructure built by that timber rush.
So he finds work pretty quickly.
Immediately, he quickly found work as an apprentice machinist, holding several jobs over the next 3 years.
But then he went back to the farm for a time, right around a pivotal. The year Edison turned on the Pearl Street station in New York City and the age of electrification.
Yes, he returned to Dearborn and married Clara Jane Bryant in 1888. But critically, this is where he honed his specialized mechanical skill, even working in an adjacent field to electrification, steam.
Right, the old.
He became extremely adept at repairing Westinghouse farm engines, these portable steam engines that powered sawmills and thresh. This work taught him the intricacies of high pressure and power transmission throughout.
But eventually, the lure of electrification, which offered a whole new level of power transmission, it brought him back to the city.
Absolutely. By 1891, Ford got a job as an engineer with the Edison Illuminating Company. He rose quickly, becoming a chief engineer by 1893 and earning a very good living. So this period frames Ford's technical expertise within that revolutionary shift toward electrification that Edison was leading a technology of high-speed, reliable power generation.
And yet, here's the fascinating part. Despite working directly for Edison, the electrification pioneer, Ford was simultaneously putting all his own energy into developing the internal combustion engine fueled by gasoline. That's a huge commitment to what seemed like an underdog technology.
That conviction is indeed fascinating, and it speaks to his independent, maybe even stubborn streak. He was immersed in the world of steam and electricity, but his passion was the petroleum-fueled vehicle, and the global race for this was already on.
Right.
We'd seen early attempts like Cugnot's steam-powered carriage way back in 1769, but steam was heavy, slow to heat, and just impractical for personal use.
And electricity had its own problems.
The electricity was clean and quiet, but the battery technology of the 1890s made vehicles heavy, expensive, and it severely limited their range. A massive commercial impact.
So petroleum offered the best mix of power density and portability.
Exactly. It was the Goldilocks. And while Ford was building electrical infrastructure in Detroit, across the pond in Germany, Carl Benz had already invented what is viewed as the first modern automobile in 1885.
So Ford was actually entering a field that was already populated by rising European firms like Peugeot, Renault, and Fiat. They were all experimenting with combustion.
Right, he wasn't the very first. But Ford was convinced petroleum was the key, and that conviction shaped his first major attempt, the quadricycle.
The one he built in his shed.
He was working part-time out of a shed behind his Detroit house, often working until midnight. The Ford quadricycle, which he developed around 1896, was primitive, but it was effective.
It was basically a bicycle with an engine, right?
Essentially, yeah. A double bicycle frame with 4 large wheels, 2-seat, and a 2-cylinder engine. It had no body to speak of, just a bench on a frame, but it was running on gasoline and contained 2 crucial gears, low speed and high speed.
But no reverse.
Telling of its experimental nature, it had no reverse gear. So if he needed to back up, he had to get out and manually push the vehicle.
So he goes from this tinkering phase to trying to commercialize it, which is where the famous early failures come. Ford Motor Company wasn't his first swing at the plate.
Not at all. His experimentation grew into a serious business pursuit by the late 1890s. In 1899, he partnered with financial backers like the timber investor William H. Murphy to set up the Detroit Automobile Company.
And it failed.
It failed spectacularly in 1901. Why? Because Ford was a relentless professional. He refused to compromise his engineering ideas for cheaper, quicker manufacturing demanded by the investors. He didn't want to sell a car that wasn't perfect, but the investors, they needed a return, and they needed it fast.
The classic clash between the engineer and the money man.
Yes. So this dissolved, and it morphed into the Henry Ford Company that same year. After further disputes, the company was spun off by its other investors and subsequently became the Cadillac Automobile Company.
Wow, so Cadillac came out of a Ford failure.
It did. This detail shows that Ford was already at the very epicenter of the emerging Detroit auto scene, even in failure, because his designs were good, they just weren't profitable enough fast enough for his early backers.
So there was another venture after that.
Another short-lived venture, Ford Malcolmson Limited, and then finally the Ford Motor Company was established in 1903 with new, more patient capital. This was the one that survived and, well, thrived.
So Ford Motor Company is founded in 1903. They have new investors, they have designs, but they don't yet have the money or capacity for true mass production. They needed a spectacle to draw in more capital. The answer, it seems, was pure speed.
That's absolutely right. Securing investment in the early 1900s often relied on public demonstrations of technical prowess. Automobile enthusiasts and businesses, they used race meets constantly to demonstrate their technical superiority.
The old race on Sunday, sell on Monday idea.
Precisely. So on January 12, 1904, in New Baltimore, Michigan, Ford demonstrated the Ford 999 Racer.
And I think it's important to note that Ford didn't drive it himself. He hired a famous bicycle racer, Barney, to manage the terrifying speed.
Correct. The 999 was a prototype designed purely for speed and spec, a truly dangerous machine. It was basically just a massive engine on a chassis with a seat. So dangerous that Ford himself, after one test run, said he'd never do it again.
Smart, man.
He hired Oldfield, the daredevil, and they set a new land speed record that day, topping 90 miles per hour, or nearly 150 kilometers per hour, on the frozen surface of Lake St. Clair.
On ice! That is just insane.
Utterly insane. But this public, highly publicized demonstration proved that Ford was a leading pioneer in high-performance engines. The result was instantaneous and crucial. Money flowed in from new investors, providing the capital needed to move beyond craft production and build a new, much larger factory.
So having secured the investment, Ford pivoted away from pure racing to focus on the true holy grail of car manufacturing, mass production for the wide market, making the car accessible to the farmer, the shopkeeper, the middle-class professional.
That was the defining ambition. Other designers were producing these luxury models, but none had created an automobile that could be made at scale and critically affordably for ordinary working people. Henry Ford was the man who finally cracked that code with the Model T.
And the Model T, the Tin Lizzie, as they called it, was the result of 2 decades of trial and error.
It was Ford's 20th car design, and it was engineered for simplicity and durability above all else. It utilized vanadium steel, which was an unusually strong and light alloy, making the car robust enough for America's still terrible rural roads.
Just what the country needed.
When the Model T was introduced in 1908, it was available in 2- or 4-seat versions, eventually featuring a hard roof.
And it cemented a key design element that is still with us today, the side the driver sits on.
A simple but powerful influence. The steering wheel and the driver's seat were placed on the left-hand side, and there were no national laws regulating this at the time. Ford's rationale was that it allowed the driver better visibility of approaching traffic and a safer path to exit the vehicle onto the curb.
And since his car sold millions,
the Model T's overwhelming commercial success everywhere led directly to the adoption of left-hand drives becoming the U.S. standard, cementing the car's influence beyond just its mechanics. At launch, its top speed was about 65 kilometers per hour, which felt blisteringly fast to someone used to horse-drawn travel.
Here is the core of the revolution, the application of Fordism and the moving assembly line. This is where he didn't just transform cars, but manufacturing globally, permanently changing how humans make things.
The assembly line was a complete philosophical and engineering break from the past. Before Ford, cars were built piece by piece, largely stationary, by teams of highly skilled crafts, a process called craft production. The assembly line, or Fordism, introduced 3 key pillars: standardized parts, specialized labor, and continuous flow.
Okay, let's break down that continuous flow. What was the technical breakthrough that actually enabled the car to move through the factory?
It wasn't one single invention, but rather the combination of gravity and conveyors. Initially, in 1913, Ford introduced gravity slides, allowing heavy components like the engine and the chassis to move across the factory floor, which limited the need for lifting.
A simple but effective idea.
Then they refined this using a moving chain or belt, which brought the parts to the workers. So instead of employing a skilled worker capable of carrying out a whole range of tasks, each worker was trained for one repetitive task, tightening the same bolt, installing the same wheel as the car moved along the line.
And the numbers illustrating the impact of this efficiency are just staggering.
They reveal the true scale of the shift. Initially, it took 12 hours and 30 minutes to manufacture a single Model T using the old stationary craft method. After several years of refinement and introducing the moving chain assembly line, that time was reduced to a stunning 93 minutes.
93 minutes from over 12 hours.
It means the company could produce approximately 10 times more cars with the same number of workers in the same amount of time. It's an incredible leap.
And that drastic time reduction is what allowed the price to plummet, putting the car in the hands of the middle class. The ultimate economic feedback.
Absolutely. The price fell in tandem with production. In 1908, the Model T was sold for $825. By 1917, the price had halved, and it eventually went down close to $300 in the 1920s.
Wow.
Think about the impact. This affordability drove astronomical sales, peaking at nearly 2 million units annually. The Model T transformed private travel, turning America into a car culture virtually overnight.
And this industrial success didn't just affect transportation, it demanded an entirely new approach to labor. This brings us to the famous and often misunderstood $5 workday.
The $5 day, introduced in 1914, is perhaps the most famous policy of Fordism after the assembly line itself. Ford abruptly doubled the minimum wage from about $2.34 a day to $5.
Which sounds incredibly generous, but this wasn't just out.
Not at all. The assembly line process, with its specialized repetitive tasks, was brutal and monotonous. Worker turnover was catastrophic, sometimes over 370% annually. They were constantly training new people, which destroyed the efficiency gains of the line.
So the $5 was essentially a retention tool, a way to stabilize the workforce and ensure loyalty.
Exactly. It reduced turnover overnight. But critically, it was also designed to create a market for his cars. Ford stated that he paid high wages so his workers could afford the very product they were making, thereby fueling the consumer economy. This model high output, low cost, relatively high wages became the bedrock of the 20th century American middle class.
But the $5 day came with a major invasive catch. It wasn't simply cash, it was a contract of morality.
This is the dark side of Ford's paternalism, and it speaks to that earlier instinct for control rooted in his family history. To qualify for the $5 wage, the workers had to submit to surveillance by Ford's sociological department.
The sociological department, that sounds Orwellian.
These investigators would visit workers' homes to check for cleanliness, financial prudence, were they saving money, and morality. They scrutinized everything from cleanliness to whether the men drank too much alcohol or whether they took in lodgers.
So he was attempting to impose his own strict Midwestern Prohibition-era moral code onto his highly diverse work. It was an attempt at social engineering.
It was pure, unadulterated social engineering. If a worker failed to meet these standards, if he was deemed immoral or too spendthrift, he was denied the higher wage. This shows how Ford's genius for industrial organization was inseparable from his profound, almost tyrannical need to manage and control the lives of the people who worked for him.
And this model fundamentally transformed Michigan itself. Detroit ballooned, becoming the global automotive capital.
Oh, massive. Detroit stood at around 450,000 people in 1910. Thanks largely to the automotive job, it hit 1 million inhabitants by 1920. Tens of thousands of workers were employed directly in Ford's factories, plus countless ancillary jobs, creating a boomtown unparalleled in American history, largely thanks to Ford's high wages attracting internal migration, new immigrants.
As the Model T became an unprecedented commercial success, selling 500,000 units in 19, Ford's operations continued even as the First World War profoundly disrupted global markets. And this immense success and the unchecked power that came with it pushed him into the political and social realm.
Ford held a deeply isolationist stance regarding World War I. He believed the U.S. should stay out of what he saw as Europe's antiquated wars between empires and royal dynasties.
Right, he funded that peace ship.
He even famously funded a peace ship excursion in 1915, attempting to sail to Europe to mediate peace, which was widely ridiculed and failed spectacularly.
Yet we immediately see the contradictions inherent in his character. Despite his professed pacifism, when the U.S. entered the conflict in April 1970, he was quick to accept massive government contracts to begin assembling military planes and equipment in Michigan. The pacifist was happy to profit handsome war machine.
He even ran for the U.S. Senate in Michigan in 1918 as a Democratic Party candidate, right toward the end of the war. That early political foray was messy. The contrast between his public pacifism and his willingness to accept large war contracts was stark. and his campaign was mired in controversy.
And he lost.
He lost narrowly to his Republican opponent, Truman Newberry, who was later prosecuted and convicted for campaign financing irregularities. So it was a dirty fight.
Beyond terrestrial politics, Ford also tried to replicate his success in a completely different sky. He was convinced commercial air travel was the next frontier.
Indeed. In the mid-1920s, he set up the Stout Metal Airplane Company and started work on the Ford Trimotor, immediately nicknamed the Tin Goose. This was an attempt to apply the Fordism principles, simplicity, durability, and standardization to aircraft.
So this was intended to be the Model T of the air, designed to carry passengers between American cities.
It was innovative. It could fit up to a dozen people, featured an all-metal corrugated fuselage, and was intended to kick off commercial airline flight. However, Ford was genuinely too far ahead of his time. Commercial air travel required massive infrastructure investment, airport, navigation systems, reliable funding that simply wasn't available outside of military applications in the 1920s.
It needed another war, really.
Mass commercial aviation needed the substantial advancements made during World War II before it became truly viable in the 1950s.
Now, we have to turn to the darker and deeply consequential side of his legacy. His immense wealth and power gave Ford a platform to disseminate some truly toxic, namely his relentless, pervasive anti-Semitism.
This is a crucial element that tragically impacted both American public discourse and historical events in Europe. In 1918, around the same time he was running for Senate, Ford purchased a small newspaper in Dearborn, the Dearborn Independent.
Okay.
He quickly transformed it, using his vast fortune to distribute it widely. It had a circulation of up to 700,000 copies, making it one of the largest weeklies in America.
And he used this newspaper as a personal, unchecked platform starting around 1920 to propagate these established, toxic, anti-Semitic tropes.
Yes, the articles pushed the idea of an international Jewish conspiracy responsible for fomenting conflicts like World War I. They argued that wealthy Jewish businessmen and financiers played an outsized and malevolent role in world affairs, politics, and the economy.
And this was based on forgeries, right?
Heavily influenced by texts like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a proven forgery.
That is a staggering reach for such malicious, untrue material. He essentially used his status as an industrial hero to lend credibility to these conspiracy theories.
That's the tragic impact. He then collected these articles and published them as a 4-volume set entitled The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. This work was not only a bestseller in the U.S., poisoning public opinion, but it was translated and published extensively across Europe, particularly in Germany, in the years leading up to Hitler's rise.
And did this publication have real-world consequences beyond just public opinion?
Historians argue that it absolutely did. Ford's views normalized prejudice, particularly within powerful business and political circles in the U.S., making it socially and politically acceptable to hold these views. This normalization is speculated to have contributed directly to the U.S., taking in fewer Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s.
Did he ever retract it?
He issued an apology in 1927 following a major libel suit brought by the Jewish activist Aaron Shapiro, and he officially ceased publication of the Dearborn Independent. But the published book, The International Jew, it continued to circulate globally for decades, often still carrying his name.
Moving into the mid-1920s, with the Model T sales, Ford embarked on his most peculiar and arguably hubristic venture, the Fordlandia project, a utopian industrial town.
This project was driven entirely by a logistical vulnerability, the rubber supply. Rubber was absolutely critical for car tires and hoses. The supply was unstable, expensive, and subject to monopolies, often under questionable moral circumstances.
Right, you have to remember how valuable rubber was then.
To truly grasp the value of rubber at this time, you need to remember the global context. Our source material cites the horrific atrocities committed in King Leopold II's Congo slave colony, entirely focused on acquiring rubber for the European and American market. People went to brutal lengths to secure this commodity.
So Ford's plan in 1928 was to secure his own source, bypassing global cartels, but on his own highly idealized utopian terms.
Exactly. He wanted self-sufficiency and moral control. His plan was to go directly to the source of the rubber tree, the state of Pará, Brazil, and build a model town. He purchased 2.5 million acres of land and named the settlement Fordlandia.
Like a little piece of Michigan in the rainforest.
The town was modeled on 19th century UK company town, like Cadbury's Bourneville. It offered good housing, swimming pools, and medical centers for the work. Ford was trying to transplant the rigid social order of a Midwestern American factory town into the middle of the Amazon rainforest.
That sounds like a recipe for a monumental cultural and logistical disaster.
It was. From the start, the American managers overseeing the prefabricated buildings and workers were entirely unused to the climate, the endemic diseases, and the sheer difficulties of operating in the Amazon. On top of that, Ford made an immediate agricultural error.
What was that?
He ordered the rubber trees to be planted close together in dense, monoculture rose, which is unnatural for the species. This created a perfect breeding ground for South American leaf blight, a devastating fungus that thrived in the dense planting and wiped out.
And on top of the agricultural blunders, he imposed that excessive paternalistic control we saw with the $5.
He did. He tried to impose American Prohibition-era social rules and his own strict moral code onto a Brazilian workforce. He banned alcohol and tobacco, regulated diets, and demanded workers adhere to his preferred schedule. Unsurprising, this led to open revolt.
So the clash between the American industrial manager and the Brazilian workforce was just too great.
It culminated in the Fordlandia riot in 1930. Workers became restless at these efforts to enforce prohibition and the rigid work rule. They began undermining the building work, throwing tools, destroying equipment. The deterioration of relations was so severe that divisions of the Brazilian army had to be called in to restore order, effectively ending Ford's utopian dream of a controlled labor environment.
And then the final economic blow came with the global financial crisis.
Automobile sales plummeted following the 1929 Wall Street crash, taking rubber prices down with the Fordlandia site, never a major source of viable rubber because of the blight, was abandoned by 1934. Today, its only legacy is the abandoned ruin, a monument to a brilliant industrialist who believed his ideas could conquer nature and culture simultaneously.
This period of the late 1920s and early 1930s also saw a growing generational conflict with a famous struggle between Henry and his only child.
Henry had become intellectually rigid, just set in his ways. He famously declared that customers could have the Model T in any color they wanted, so long as it is black. He genuinely believed the Model T's stratospheric success guaranteed Ford's future success forever.
It's the danger of relying too much on one foundational product. It's analogous to the risk of a modern company like Apple becoming too reliant on the iPhone.
A perfect analogy. And Edsel, who was closer to the younger generation, perceived that his father's traditionalism would cripple the company as rivals innovated.
Edsel was the voice of modernization and style.
Exactly. General Motors, under Alfred P. Sloan, was introducing annual model changes, offering credit, providing a range of colors and options. Henry refused all of this. Edsel essentially had to coerce his father into modernization, often enduring his father's public humiliation and micromanagement.
What were Edsel's key technological achievements that...
Through the late 1920s and 1930s, Edsel slowly won out. He pushed for the Model A in 1927 to finally replace the Model T. But the true technological leap came with the Model 18, launched in 1932. This car featured the V8 8-cylinder piston engine, a massive break.
Why was that so important?
Before the V8, an 8-cylinder engine was only available in high-end luxury cars, costing a fortune.
So Edsel applied the core principle of Fordism, mass production and affordability, to a high-performance.
Exact. The V8 was the first affordable, mass-produced 8-cylinder engine, offering superb performance. This became the standard in American automobile and was a huge advantage against Chrysler. Edsel also pushed for diversification, launching higher-end sports cars under the Lincoln brand, like the Zephyr and the Continental, ensuring Ford appealed to wealthier customers. The company was changing direction in the 1930s, largely thanks to Edsel's foresight countering his father's tradition.
The 1930s also saw Henry Ford become even more directly involved in political affairs, specifically regarding the growing schism over Europe. And this context highlights the deeply contradictory nature of his global business.
It is truly one of the most bizarre geopolitical balancing acts in industrial history. Because of his naked anti-Semitism, propagated through the international Jew, Ford had become an admired figure within Nazi Germany, the regime that would soon begin the mass murder of Europe's Jewish people.
Hitler admired him.
Hitler even kept Ford's portrait in his office. At the exact same time, Ford Motor Company was providing technical advice and machinery to the Soviet Union Nazism's mortal enemy, helping set up its first major automobile factories in Russia in the 1930s.
So what was the economic rationale for simultaneously dealing with the greatest enemies of the coming global conflict?
Pure industrial pragmatism. For the Soviet Union, Ford offered the know-how needed to rapidly industrialize their economy, which was a strategic goal for Stalin. For Hitler, the admiration was ideological, and Ford's German subsidiary was highly profitable and growing. Ford was willing to deal with any regime that allowed him to practice his industrial philosophy and access resources or market, regardless of their political ideology. Money and manufacturing trumped morality.
Once war broke out in Europe in 1939, Ford quickly returned to his isolationist roots and joined the most powerful isolationist movement in U.S. history.
He became the most influential member of the America First Committee, set up in September 1940. This was a broad coalition of figures: pacifists, businessmen, isolationists, and some anti-interventionists, including prominent figures like the aviator Charles Lindbergh. They campaigned aggressively against U.S. entry into the European War, even as President Roosevelt ramped up aid to Britain and the Soviet Union.
And the America First Committee might have succeeded in keeping the U.S. out of the conflict had it not been for developments across the Pacific.
That's the catalyst. The Empire of Japan, running low on petroleum due to U.S. resource limits, launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, in December 1941 to gain access to the oil fields of Southeast Asia. The U.S. entry into the Second World War immediately followed.
And the America First Committee immediately disbanded. Ford, ever the industrial opportunist, pivoted instantly, repurposing his vast factories for war production.
He did, showcasing his genius for scale one last. Ford became synonymous with war production, building immense facilities like the Willow Run bomber plant outside of Detroit. This was the largest factory under a single roof in the world at the time.
The scale of Willow Run is almost unbelievable. What was the output?
Willow Run was dedicated to mass-producing the massive B-24 Liberator bomber. Initially, Ford struggled to apply assembly line techniques to complex aircraft production. But eventually, they streamlined the process so dramatically that they achieved an incredible rate of production. At their peak, they were churning out one complete B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Overall, Ford produced over 8,600 of these bombers, a staggering achievement that was crucial to the Allied war effort.
But this heavy wartime production coincided with a massive personal and professional blow to Henry, the death of his only child and heir, Edsel.
It was a tremendous disaster. Edsel, who was the de facto head of the company and who had done the most to modernize it, died young, only 49, from complications of stomach cancer on May 26, 1943. Henry, who was approaching 80, was heartbroken, but immediately attempted to step back in and take over the day-to-day operations directly during the peak of wartime stress.
But Henry Sr. was not up to the task. His health was failing, and the business quickly began to unravel under his erratic leadership.
Historians believe he may have suffered several debilitating heart attacks or strokes during this period. He was clearly in no condition to run a major, complicated war corporation. He fired competent managers and reversed some of Edsel's crucial modernization effort. After struggling for 2 years and under immense pressure from his wife Clara and the Roosevelt administration, which was concerned that Ford's inability to manage was hurting war production, he finally made the decision to hand control to the third generation,
which was Edsel's son, Henry Ford II.
Henry Ford II, who had served in the U.S. Navy, was thrust into the presidency of the Ford Motor Company in September 1945, just as the war was ending. He was only 28 years old.
A huge weight on his shoulders.
Henry Sr. lived for only a short time longer, dying peacefully on April 7, 1947 at age 83 from a cerebral hemorrhage at his Dearborn estate.
He was mourned widely in Michigan as a revolutionary industrialist and a generous employer. But despite that goodwill, the company itself was in deep financial trouble at the time.
Financially, it was in dire straits, having lost hundreds of millions of dollars during Henry Sr.'s brief return to power. The company had lost its competitive edge due to the clash between Henry's outdated views and Edsel's modernization attempts. Luckily, Henry Ford II proved incredibly capable. He immediately hired a group of young, talented executives, often called the Whiz Kid, and focused relentlessly on streamlining operations.
And their post-war launch cemented the company's recovery.
The 1949 Ford was the company's first major new model after the war. It was sleek, modern, and it capitalized perfectly on the post-war economic boom and the expanding American middle class. This success allowed Henry II to take the firm public in 1956, the largest initial public offering in U.S. history at the time.
But even after going public, the family found a way to maintain substantial perpetual control, ensuring their influence persists. How did that financial structure work?
It was ingenious and a testament to the family's desire for legacy control. When they went public, they split the stock into two classes, Class A shares, which were sold to the public, and Class B shares, which were retained entirely by the Ford family. Critically, while the Class B shares represented a minority of the total equity, they were granted the power to elect a majority of the board of directors.
So they kept.
This unique structure ensures that the Fords have maintained a central, controlling role in the company's direction down to the present day, unlike other industrial dynasties who sold off their influence over time.
So what does this all mean? Henry Ford's story is the improbable American narrative, the son of impoverished immigrants on the American frontier who caught the engineering bug, worked for Thomas Edison, and went out on his own to become a global titan. He transformed industrial manufacturing with the model, and, most enduringly, with the revolutionary concept of the assembly line that defined production across the entire 20th century.
But we have to view him as a complete pack. The story of Henry Ford is not simply one of industrial genius. It's also one of immense, unchecked hubris. That same confidence that allowed him to innovate the V8 engine and the moving assembly line also led him to believe he could conquer the Amazonian jungle and, far more tragically, use his platform to disseminate anti-Semitic venom through publications like the international Jew.
The genius and the darkness are inseparable.
The technological genius and the dark political agenda are inseparable parts of the same.
His legacy is just so contradictory. He created the modern concept of the middle-class consumer by paying high wages, but he simultaneously implemented a system of invasive surveillance and control over those very workers. He produced the tools of freedom, the affordable personal car, but he also used his influence to fuel some of the darkest, most oppressive ideology of the 20th century.
We have to ask ourselves, should Henry Ford be primarily remembered as the individual who ushered in the automobile revolution, changing global production forever and creating massive economic prosperity? Or is his legacy fundamentally compromised by the clear, demonstrated anti-Semitism and the controversial political dealings that were fueled by the power that industrial genius afforded?
That is the complex weight of his 20th century impact. If his genius was predicated on ruthless efficiency and standardization, can we consider the moral compromise and social control he exercised as just another form of that same industrial? That's something for you to mull over as you consider the true cost of the industrial initiative.